So, can I start by saying, thanks for inviting me. Lovely to be here. Sorry to be arriving a couple of minutes late as well. I was commuting from Mount Tambourine where I've been visiting my folks. So I received, because I haven't been to one of these events in the library before, I received some mixed signals about the nature of the event. So I have come with two possibilities of what I can present to you. Can I let you choose based on which fits the format better? Only because one description I had of this event is a very informal sort of discussion, and then I saw a description of it as a lecture. So I have both a scholarly paper that I've recently written, which I can read to you, if it's more of the lecture thing, or I can talk more informally about something I haven't written yet but intend to write about, so it'll be a bit less polished and a bit less precise. Can you choose which one you want? Oh, okay. I'm
Relax.
I wish I could say I'm delighted with that decision. I'm disappointed, of course, because it's easier to read something. But I'll try anyway to introduce you to some ideas I've been thinking a lot about, and I've been doing some writing for the last couple of years about how salvation is understood in early Christian theology, and I'm trying to come up with, I suppose, with a slightly richer and more interesting and more accurate way of thinking about the theology of early Christianity. So a little bit of background. There are a couple of things that worry me a lot about the usual things I hear about salvation in early Christian theology. One of them is the enduring influence of a little book by Gustav Ahlin, a Scandinavian Lutheran bishop, who wrote a book in the 1930s called Christus Victor, and for various reasons, various historical reasons, it was originally written as a sort of contribution to ecumenical discussion, to try to expose the flaws of both Roman Catholic and evangelical Protestant and liberal Protestant understandings of the death of Christ. And he wanted to propose essentially what he thought was an Eastern Orthodox, ancient Eastern Orthodox view, which he thought could be an ecumenical meeting ground. So, and the book was used in certain ecumenical gatherings in the 1930s. He was a key figure in early ecumenism. So for those sorts of historical reasons, this book had a huge influence, and it continues to be taught in seminaries and theological colleges. It continues to, if you talk to ministers about the atonement or the death of Christ, often this is the kind of thing they remember from their theological education. And essentially, Ahlin's view was that the evangelical and Catholic understanding that Christ saves through a sacrifice that propitiates the wrath of God, he thinks that's a very unsatisfactory picture of God. The liberal Protestant view, Christ saves by having a moral influence, so just by setting a great example, we shape our lives and become better people. He thinks that's a very unsatisfactory view. Both of these are complete caricatures anyway, of course. And the winner in his account is what he calls Christus Victor, and he says, in early Christian theology, Jesus Christ saves because in his death, God is engaged in kind of hand-to-hand combat against the powers of evil, against Satan. And so the sacrifice of Christ is a sacrifice offered to the devil in order to trick him and defeat his power. That way of sort of mapping out the history of Christian theology, and that lens for thinking about early Christian theology, I think is hugely unhelpful and problematic even though I respect and sort of admire the ecumenical ambitions of that book, and probably it was a very useful ecumenical proposal, and part of the long, one whole story of what has been going on in modern theology is a recovery of patristic and Eastern Orthodox theological traditions in the Western Church. And so the book, I think, has been significant and has had some really beneficial in turning Western readers towards writers like Irenaeus and Athanasius. But the actual theological framework is hugely problematic and provides a grid which, once you adopt it, you simply fail to see what's really going on in early Christian theology. So that's one part of the background, one thing that worries me. Another part of the background, by background I mean things that have provoked me to try and do some work on this. A much more contemporary thing that provokes me is the sacrificial theory of Rene Girard. So, and I won't explain this in detail, but I'm sure some of you will be familiar with Girard, who, just as Freud had argued that at the roots of all civilization are murder and violence, and then kind of covering up of that fact, so all society is founded on murder, founded on violence, which we then have to conceal. That's Freud's basic idea about where civilization comes from. And in a similar way, Girard argues that social order is founded on sacrifice. The thing that makes it possible for us to live together is the instrument of sacrifice by which we can, he, through a very problematic interpretation of the scapegoat in the book of Leviticus, he argues that we can, as a kind of substitute for social tension, we can project it onto a scapegoat and murder the scapegoat, and in this bloody act, it becomes possible for us to go on living together. This provokes me. Gustav Aulin provokes me because I want to understand what salvation actually is, and I think he makes it harder, not easier, to understand what salvation is. Girard's approach provokes me partly because of its huge influence in Australia. He is more widely loved and read and taken seriously, my impression is, in Australian theology than probably anywhere else. Again, for local historical sorts of reasons. Partly because I think sacrifice is an important theme in the scriptures and in Christian reflection on Christ. But again, once you adopt the Girardian paradigm, everything that's most interesting about sacrifice in the Bible and in Christian thought is filtered out. It all looks like murder, like violence, like substitutionary violence. So maybe if I can make a couple of comments about how I've been trying to think through this and how I've been trying to come up with an alternative way of talking about salvation in the early church. So can I start with do you, since this is your event, do you want me to keep talking or just stop and have a little bit of discussion in between before I move on? How do you normally like to do it?
We do differently every time.
Okay. Does anyone want to have any questions at this point for clarification? Or, if you're a Girard scholar or something, just forgive me for not liking it. But
you've really piqued our interest, so you've got to give us some more now.
Okay.
Given you've chucked everything out that we hold dear. That's just the background. So here are some of the ideas I've been working with. Sacrifice is the paper I was thinking I would read you if you wanted a lecture, and I've just been doing some writing about this, looking at how the book of Leviticus was interpreted in early Christian theology. The greatest early Christian interpretation of this is by Origen of Alexandria, who wrote a quite deep and profound commentary homilies, sermons on the book of Leviticus. And sacrifice is one of the main themes that runs right through those 3rd century sermons. And here's the kind of takeaway message for me. I've been interested just in looking at the complexities of those homilies and the complexities of how Origen deals with different passages in the book of Leviticus. But some of my conclusions based on this, and by the way, I'm singling this out because it is by far the most sacrificial text in early Christian theology. No other text talks as much about sacrifice. The only close competitor would be Melito of Sardis in a liturgical text of the 2nd century. And Origen has even been called the theologian of sacrifice because of these homilies. That's what Adolf von Harnack called. Here's how he thinks about sacrifice in these sermons. By contrast to Girard, Origen sees sacrifice primarily not as a killing, but as a meal. And indeed, in Leviticus, many of the sacrifices do not involve bloodshed, death, even the scapegoat. You don't actually kill it, do you? Which is a weird fact about Girard, bases his whole theory of murder. He kind of puts the scapegoat into Freud's theory of civilization, overlooking the fact that the goat doesn't die. But a number of the other sacrifices are wheat and grain, and there's the thing they have in common is they are food. Not that there is bloodshed, not that there is violence. And Origen is fascinated by, his basic way of thinking about sacrifice is that it is a joyous festal offering which believers offer up to God. And let's say when you're barbecuing the lamb, the thing that it does to God, it's not that God is angry and that this turns away God's anger. It's not that it is an act of violence which somehow satisfies some sinister itch within God for a bit of bloodshed. The thing that it does is it delights God. The smell of that offering brings joy and pleasure to God. Why? Not because of the actual physical offering, but because in bringing an offering, what I'm actually bringing is always my heart, myself. This is why, for example, in the prophets, and in some of the Psalms as well, sacrifice is criticized. I hate your offerings. I hate you. Or in Psalm 51, I'd make a sacrifice for my sins, but you don't delight in that. The sacrifice that pleases God is a broken heart. So Origen has this sort of prophetic, Old Testament prophetic framework for thinking about the significance of sacrifice, and he consistently emphasizes that the true sacrifice is spiritual. You can exhibit, just like if let's say if a spouse was to express their love by giving a gift, the significance of the gift is the relational thing that it expresses. It's a way of ritualizing or of making concrete and visible the state of one's heart. And so Origen thinks of sacrifice in that kind of way. Why is sacrifice offered then? It's offered for the joy of God, because God delights in the God who has given so much grace and love and generosity to the human race. When human beings make a reciprocal response, when they reciprocate that love and generosity, it brings God joy, because what God delights in is relationship with human beings. So Origen sees the sacrifice in a positive tone. The joy that the sacrifice brings to the people is very significant too. And again, if you're thinking of the more, there are some sacrificial passages, let's say in the Iliad, where there's a human sacrifice and blood spills out and soaks into the ground. Wonderful scenes, and then the God who is about to pulverize you is temporarily placated, but they'll be back. That sort of dark, sinister, pagan conception of the significance of the sacrifice is absent in Origen's account. The sacrifice brings joy to God. It also brings joy to the community. So the setting for the sacrifice for Origen is always a festival, a special meal. The places in Western culture where there is still something like a sacrifice in this sense might be the Christmas lunch, where the meal is shared as an act of communal joy. It brings us together as we eat together. And yes, you have to kill the pig in order to have the Christmas ham and, boil a few prawns or whatever you're going to do. It involves death insofar as you're preparing a meal, but it's the kitchen is the site for thinking about the significance of that death, not some kind of pagan stone altar soaked in blood. Or if you've ever been to an American Peter's been to some, so an American Thanksgiving lunch, that is more like the way Origen thinks about sacrifice, an act which is directed towards God and which constitutes and forms a community around. So there's one theme of sacrifice that I've been thinking about. I'll move on to another one in a second. You can see how I'm not directly trying to sort of disprove the whole of Girard's thinking, but I'm trying to point to a quite different way that Christians think about sacrifice, and a way that I know we have a Leviticus scholar in the room, and so there are different views about Leviticus, but at least some scholars don't think that Leviticus anyway was ever written as a practical manual for how to carry out rituals in the temple, but more already a sort of spiritual rabbinical text that's already being read in something like the way Origen reads it, as a template of the architecture of the spiritual life, the way in which the soul responds to God, the way in which the community responds to God. So regardless, and I might be, Lee might like to comment on the book of Leviticus as such, but at least my hunch is that Origen is much closer to the world of the Bible and the world of the Old Testament, and this positive spiritual conception of the festal offering, the significance of holidays in Israel's history. All of that is invisible once you've got Girard's model of a violent murder. So Lee, you can correct
no,
this
so
whole
it's not on
thing.
Leviticus. It's more a question before you move off Origen. What does he do with a text like Genesis 22, which seems to be a story told quite late in Israel's history to account for sacrifice on the Temple Mount, where it is a human being replaced by an animal, and so the human can't be understood as a meal as such. Does Origen do anything with?
Well, yeah, that passage is quite extensively used in early Christian preaching and writing. I'm trying to think of exactly. The assumption is always that Isaac is a type of Christ, that he prefigures Christ, and that the other thing that I think tends to be highlighted is that it's as if once God has seen once Abraham has actually directed his heart towards God, he has said the internal spiritual yes to God in the very fact that he gets up early in the morning and goes. That's all that God requires and all that God ever requires. So whereas perhaps the modern tendency would be to highlight the ram, God has provided the ram. This shows that God does require a sacrifice, but in this case is willing to accept the blood of the ram instead of the blood of a human. that might be a modern theological way to think about it. The ram, I don't think, plays much significance at all, from what I can remember in early Christian preaching about this text. It's Abraham's heart, his faith. Yeah, his obedience, like in the New Testament, because that's the themes that get isolated in the New Testament. The echo between Isaac and Christ gets picked up in the New Testament, and the faith of Abraham, the fact that something is happening between Abraham and God, something invisible and intangible is happening in the heart of Abraham, that gets picked up as well in the New Testament. So the fact that somehow God requires violent blood shed is not part of the way. It's just not part of their assumption, I guess. You see, the other. I haven't quite answered your question. I don't know, but.
Well, it's just if his view is sacrifice is a meal, and if this mount is the Temple Mount, then it seems to be. I'm just interested to know, well, what does he do with the fact that somehow it's interpreting the meaning of sacrifice, it seems, at Jerusalem and I see where it's possible that he's doing it through the faith of Abraham that's associating, that would be consistent then with his view that it's about symbolic offering of the heart in this animal, and perhaps that's where it is. He's offering his son as a symbolism. I was just wondering what he does with the meal.
And it's the fact, so I don't want to exaggerate the meal thing or just stretch it across everything. It's in his homilies on Leviticus because he thinks that's what's going on
what it is
in Leviticus. And he doesn't. This is where he's different again from someone like Girard, or say from some evangelical interpretations of sacrifice. Origen does not think there is a single sacrificial logic which you can extract from the Bible and then just apply it everywhere. He emphatically doesn't think that. In fact, at a number of points in the homilies on Leviticus, he says his whole fascination with Leviticus is that this shows how many types of sacrifices there are. And there are a couple of points where he says, look how many sacrifices. We'll never have time in our lives to understand them all. He's so intrigued by the number of different ways in which the human heart can say yes to God. And this fits more, I think, with his Alexandrian theology of the Logos, where Christ, the incarnate Logos, is perfectly and uniquely adapted to every individual human being. So each person will experience God's grace and God's self-communication in a unique way that is adapted to the exact level that they're at and the exact condition of life and context that they come from. And that sort of infinite flexibility by which God is accommodated to human beings, I think that's shaping the way he thinks that the significance of sacrifice is not that it discloses some logic about the way God always relates to human beings, but that it discloses the infinite variety of God's way of accepting reciprocal love from the human partner. Does that make sense? So he doesn't project the meal onto the sacrifice of Isaac. That text gets discussed in its own way. And Isaac is significant. Also because the faith of Abraham is one way of focusing on that text. But the way Isaac is seen as a kind of hero because he is thought to foreshadow Christ. Do you know Kierkegaard's book on the sacrifice or the offering of Isaac? Is it Fear and Trembling? Oh, you've got a Kierkegaard scholar here too now. This is unbelievable. In that one where there are these multiple interpretations, wonderful, and you think you've just got this amazing interpretation, and then he just sort of scrunches that one up and throws it away and gives you another one, even more amazing. But in one of those, Isaac, I might be remembering right, I haven't read it for a while, but is this right? Isaac sees a sort of flicker of doubt and hesitation on his father's face, and Isaac's faith is shattered. He is so disillusioned with his father when he is himself an agent in what's going on in other things, not just the passive victim. And I think that element of the agency of Isaac is the thing that the early Christians, in a different way, that they think of Isaac as an agent too, who foreshadows Christ. Have I remembered the thing right? It's a great book, isn't it? It's amazing. You come away from that thinking, Abraham is a giant. He is spiritual.
What's it called?
Fear and Trembling.
Available in the library.
Yeah, it's in the library. It's in the library. Wonderful book. It's more like a novel, or like a series of novellas, each giving a completely different interpretation of what that story is all about. Maybe not novellas, short stories. Okay, so sacrifice is one thing. Here's another one. And this is not directly related to the preceding comments about sacrifice and so on. This is just an example of something that I think vanishes if you accept the Christus Victor type paradigm, which is entirely focused around, as much as it tries to recover an Eastern Orthodox perspective, it's entirely focused around what exactly happens on the cross. And if you know a little bit of the theology of the Eastern Church, if that's your whole paradigm, you'll miss out on most of what they think is interesting. Incarnation, for example. So, the theme of Jesus Christ as the teacher is, I think, overwhelmingly one of the most important images that the early Christians had for thinking about how Christ saves. Christ saves by being the wise teacher. Again, I'll use Origen for an example, although the project I'm trying to work on is not Origen specifically. No, I'll use Clement of Alexandria for an example. He wrote one of his great books. So he is a generation before Origen. He is a kind of Alexandrian philosopher in the days before Christian theology or Christian institutions have really developed very much at all. And he has a little school of disciples, the way you might imagine Plato or Aristotle or Socrates having a group of disciples who are there to learn, both to study certain disciplines like mathematics and astronomy, grammar and rhetoric, and to learn the way of life that will lead to salvation. So Clement of Alexandria is teaching in that sort of environment. One of his books is called The Pedagogue, Christ the Teacher. And it's about the way Jesus Christ reveals the way of salvation through his teaching. The thing I find, I'm trying to isolate a couple of significant things about this thing. Christ is the teacher, above all in the way that I just mentioned about he is the Logos, God's self-communication, which is intimately adapted to every single person. You might know that some of these early Christians also thought that even in the non-Christian world, the Logos will be carefully adapted to the level that each person is at. So, how was Socrates so wise? Well, through the same creative Logos that was adapted to the conditions and the context of Greek culture. This same divine Logos has been revealed in Christ, and the teaching that is given to each one is the teaching that brings us to salvation. I think this is... Again, I'll just try and give you what I think is the kind of take-home message about this, which is the fact that if you read the four Gospels, one of the most obvious things that you can say about Jesus is he is a teacher. In Mark he's more like the prophetic preacher. In Matthew he is the authoritative teacher of the law, and in fact he is the divine voice that speaks through the law, so that you can't, you have heard that it was said, but I say to you, the law is his law, and he is the authoritative teacher and revealer of God's law, God's wisdom, God's way. So this very, very obvious fact about Jesus, again, our whole question is always, how exactly was our salvation achieved when Jesus died on the cross? Then the whole ministry of Jesus often seems to fade in, relatively anyway, to fade in its significance, as if somehow Jesus had to, the remark by one German scholar that the Gospels are a passion narrative with a long preface. That type of assumption. Well, here's a few things just to let you know who Jesus was. He healed people, he taught, proclaimed the coming kingdom of God, and then the passion narrative. And the early Christians don't think of it that way. They are so huge, like endlessly fascinated with what it means for Christ to have come among us as our teacher, as the one who reveals God's will for us and God's way. They thought of this teaching as, there's a mix here, I would say, between the Gospels and the idea of the Hellenistic philosopher. Again, think of someone like Aristotle with his school of pupils, and they're not just learning about how to dissect frogs and study the planets. They're learning how to adopt a philosophical way of life, which will be a kind of purified life. So they're studying lifestyle as well as, and that's what philosophy meant in Greek culture. You get a kind of fusion of those two things in early Christianity, so that Jesus is our teacher, and what that means is he reveals to us a whole way of life. We would call it today probably discipleship, or the Christian pilgrimage, or something like this. But for the early Christians, this isn't the thing that happens after you've been saved. This is what salvation means, to be in lifelong communion with the person of Jesus, constantly growing more and more into his truth, constantly living more and more into his light, constantly having your life kind of living out your baptism more and more and more. So Jesus is our teacher, and we enroll in his school. We become his pupils or disciples, and that lifelong education is what salvation means for someone like Clement, for someone like Origen as well. In fact, even the life of the world to come for these early Christian thinkers is not thought of as a kind of stasis. So we've been growing through the Christian life, we've been growing in our discipleship until the day we die, and then finally get to sit in the beanbag and watch TV for a minute. Isn't that more or less the assumption now? Like, heaven is static. It's you can see why children intuitively ask, but wouldn't heaven be boring? All Christian children ask that question. It's not because they're so godless, it's because they've heard so well what is actually said in the churches, where heaven is portrayed as the end of growing, of learning. Anyway, the way the life of the world to come is understood, Origen develops this at great length. In this life, he says in one text, the whole of our discipleship in this life is kind of like learning the alphabet, learning a few basics, so that when your real education begins in the life of the world to come, you'll be off to a running start. Otherwise, if you do a really lame job of the Christian life in this life, you'll still be a total beginner in the life of the world to come. It'll take you longer to live more fully into joy. So the life of discipleship and of pilgrimage is a kind of arc that continues infinitely and eternally. And the joy of heaven, especially in the Alexandrian tradition, in the early church, the joy of heaven is the joy of unceasing learning. That it's always another discovery around the corner. There is always even more of God than what we had grasped before, even deeper depths of God's love that we can discover and contemplate. So Christ saves us by being the teacher who leads us on this path of discipleship. And I hope you can see there's a theme in common there's an element in common between this teacher model and the sacrifice model, and that is the element of joy and of personal communion. Our personal union with God that we celebrate and enact in the sacrifice, in the offering of ourselves, and the fact that the thing we're always going to be growing into in discipleship is the joy of personal union. And that is a joy which, by definition, you couldn't exhaust, because how would you ever have got all of God? You'll always be a beginner in one way. You'll always be just on the brink of new discoveries, new depths of life and love. So it's a very, whereas to go back to Gustav Ahlin, it's like, what is the sinister diabolical problem from which we have to be saved? And then you line up all the possibilities and see which one's the best. As soon as we approach the question of salvation with that type of problem, what's the diabolical problem from which we need to be rescued? Again, I feel that this very positive vision of what the salvation is becomes impossible to see, because we filter everything out to be what's the solution to our plight. And that is a very, very constraining and narrow way of thinking about salvation. The plight for early Christianity is significant, but just a little bit trivial at the same time, because the grace that God gives us is abounding grace. It's far more than you need to fix a problem. So there's a second thing: Christ the pedagogue, Christ the teacher, and Christ the sacrifice. I don't even know how much we're going for time or anything, but are there time to ask if there's any more?
Yeah, there's some questions.
And then if there's time, there's a third thing that I will talk about, but I should put out my little clock here so that I've got some idea of what's going on. Any comments about this teacher model?
So there's a sense in which in the early church...
I can see you're utterly riveted. Please, not all the questions at once.
Their view of salvation wasn't one of being perfect, you'll be perfect the other side of death, and they're sitting around. They did have a view of Jesus would continue to be the teacher who reveals the Father type thing.
Yeah, so perfection means, actually, I mean, many scholars think this is kind of like what Wesley meant by perfection too. Not stasis, not achieving something from which no further progress is required, but perfection as a path, as a trajectory that is limitless, and insofar as you're on that path into the depths of communion with God, that path is perfection. You could mark, like, it might have a lower point on the line, which you could mark as perfection. You are living upward into union with God, and in the life of the world to come, you'll still be on the same line. And again, you could mark a spot and say, I've been changed, we've been changed from one degree of glory to another. The perfection now is more than it was before, but it's not the end either. So the perfection is a word that's used often to describe salvation in the early church, but it means something like this trajectory, walking in the light, living in the light. That is the life of perfection, even though you'll always be striving to gain more and to go further. Yeah.
Yeah, so I appreciate the critique of Girard as if, I think you're right that he sort of takes some single model of sacrifice and then reads it everywhere. I think that's a problem. I wonder, though, if there's a way in which you could view a kind of Girardian theology of salvation that does some of the things that you want to do. If, for instance, the main problem for Girard is rivalry, that social forms are always locked in various forms of rivalry with one another, and what Christ teaches us is how to sort of love each other rather than be in rivalry with each other. And I think for Girard, this would be a kind of never-ending process of learning how to extricate ourselves from rivalry and put ourselves in relationships of love. And I think there's a way you can read that. It doesn't have to just read it as this sort of punctual, sacrificial thing that then just has a mechanism that solves a problem. It's a re-education into a way of living and into a way of loving the neighbor, I think. So it's interesting what you think about that.
Maybe. I still worry. I hear where you're coming from, Peter. I think that's a great suggestion. I still worry that the whole human predicament has been framed in almost nihilistic or Manichaean sort of terms, where so living in, growing into love within that framework is still a more or less holding the darkness at bay somehow. I think maybe I'm exaggerating. I have to talk more about what you have in mind, but can I just suggest an alternative, without getting too intra-Girard about an alternative, because these key concepts, desire, mimesis, the basic model that Peter's referring to, each of us becomes socialized by learning to copy the desires of others. So as you become socialized as a child, let's say, and human beings have this remarkable innate tendency to imitate. Aristotle already talked about that, how we are like the imitating animal. That's one of our marks, is the way we imitate one another. Just for example, if I started to cry right now, I bet you I could look around and find people with tears welling in their eyes. Why? There's this innate sympathy, this innate irrational tendency to imitate. So Girard talks about the fact that we learn desire by imitating the desires of others. Then once there's two of us who are desiring the same object, this creates rivalry. Instead of being violent to one another, we can have a scapegoat, and that lets us get along with each other. Can I give you an alternative from early Christianity? Again, trying to set it. I feel that this is somehow bathed in a pagan darkness, and whereas the early Christians used it. What's that?
You're the liberator of life.
No, I don't want to be too just using hyperbole. But in early Christianity, the concepts of desire and imitation are critical concepts, and it's all bathed in the light of the gospel somehow. So, and here's why I think it's a different paradigm. Our true and innate and God-given desire, which early Christians think is absolutely built into us, is the desire for God. Or as they sometimes say, the desire for the beautiful. Not just beautiful things, which we always desire, but each of those beautiful things that we learn to desire as children and as we grow through life, each of those beautiful things is a kind of echo of the true and lasting beauty that we are built for, union with God. And so the thing that is best and the thing that's worst about us is this inbuilt capacity for desire. It's best in us because it makes possible our union with God, and it makes possible extraordinary experiences of community with other people, where we gather together in order to kind of collectively direct our desire towards God. So it's the noblest and highest dimension of the human being, and it's the most devastating and most destructive, because when we forget the beautiful and instead project a transcendent longing onto fragments of beauty within creation, that produces, it is essentially idolatry, and it produces all kinds of violence and not getting along and so on. So there's, I'm not saying that is completely incompatible with what Girard's doing, but there's a background assumption that desire is innately good, redeemable. Yes, it's broken in the way we experience it, but Girard, I think, doesn't have this element of transcendence, if you could call it that, or a sense that this is a very disordered way of experiencing desire. So if you think of a book like Augustine's Confessions, which basically says yes to all manner of worldly desires, even the erotic sensual ones, yes, insofar as they're leading you up to, insofar as that they're channeling your yearning for God. But any worldly desire, whether it's for education or career or erotic love or whatever, anyone which becomes an end in itself will actually end up destroying the object that you're directing that huge intensity of desire onto. So we think of possessive lovers, where one ends up destroying the other because no creature can bear the weight of transcendent desire. That desire is meant for God. And so Augustine's Confessions is the story of the way all desires can be healed and ultimately affirmed and sanctified simply as the heart is, through a long process of the heart's redirection towards the true object of desire. All other gifts become good gifts once the heart is yearning for God. And any gift becomes sinister and destructive once the heart has set itself on that thing. So there's a basically redeemable picture of desire. And imitation in the early church as well. I think there's just as realistic a notion of how much imitation conditions our lives in this world. But in Girard, imitation, you know how it has this basically destructive, problematic function? The early Christians knew that. For example, the way you learn to rejoice in the gladiatorial spectacles, the fact that there's a whole crowd roaring with delight as the blood spills onto the ground, you find yourself, just like your eyes well up with tears when I cry, you find yourself feeling a surge of joy. You're learning Satan's way through imitation. You know? But that imitative capacity is an inherently good one too, and the mark that a saint leaves upon a person's spirit when you encounter a holy person, and it can shape the rest of your life. One holy life can have this lasting, it can do something deep to you as a person. One holy parent for the early Christians can completely shape the direction of a person's life in ways that you can never fully comprehend because of this mysterious capacity for imitation. So the early Christians don't think of imitation just as something that is part of this problematic, destructive mechanism, but it's also one of the main ways that we become trained and educated for salvation, is by learning to imitate the lives of saints and martyrs, by singling out holy lives within our communities and adopting them as our models. And ultimately, all of that leads to Christ. Imitate me as I imitate Christ, as St. Paul said. So again, there's a fundamentally redeemable, positive sort of picture of these categories, which I think, maybe this was too long-winded an answer, but I feel like you could take that basically positive Christian picture and integrate some of Girard's insights with it. If you start with Girard, I feel like you've already locked out transcendence, you've locked out grace, you've locked out redemption, and you're back to the kind of more like a Freudian picture where the best you can do is manage neuroses, which will never go away. Therapy doesn't cure you with Freud, it just helps you to stop destroying your relationships. It's a management of disorder, and salvation for Christian theology, I don't think, is a management of disorder. It's about the positive flourishing and growth of life till we become full human beings who know as we are known, see face to face. Is that helpful?
Now, can I just, are you going to wrap up? So I just want to ask one question, because I bet you've got an answer.
I'll give a longer answer even. No, I won't. I'll give a one-sentence answer.
So the kind of like on this thinking of Christ the teacher and the thinking Christian perfection as this like infinite this classroom where infinite learning takes place in the world to come. As you know, there's any number of process thinkers then will want to draw an analogy, imitate me as I imitate Christ, between the divine life and the endless learning of the creature, and frame that in process terms.
Like God is always being educated too.
Yes, that God's always in this process of becoming.
Yeah.
So how do you think, like, what's the strongest kind of way that the patristics are not? I know they're not having this conversation, but how would you respond to that kind of framing of patristic and process theology?
Yeah. So, just to be clear, is the point you're making that if we are to be infinitely growing like this, is it because we're the image of God that somehow this would imply God is constantly evolving and changing too? Is that the logic?
I think that would be the logic in process theology, that imitate me as I imitate Christ would be to participate in the endless becoming of God, is how it would be.
Yes, right. So, yeah, and obviously, as you know, Janice, that's a big set of issues. I'll just give one, and I'm aware that our time's up. I'll give one suggestion. I think so the early Christians would see that as a quite incoherent position, because the only reason they think of human growth as infinite is because God is infinite. So because if God were on the way somewhere, that would actually imply that there is something finite about God. If God can ever, for example, if God can ever improve, well, that implies change and improves that God was not yet what God would be. That's finitude, right? If God were finite, even very great, no doubt, the process God, of course, is bigger than you and me put together. No matter how great.
Both of them?
However, so the basic logic of this is, it's because God is already all perfection to an infinite, unchanging degree, that our knowledge and growth into God can never have any limit. And you can never even, you will always be at the beginning. So if you, in other words, according to the logic of patristic theology, if you had a God who was conditioned by these limitations of growth and progress, it would actually mean that our knowledge and growth would have to be limited instead. If God is infinitely perfect, then our growth and our knowledge and our union with God is infinite. So I'm not saying that is a knockdown argument against process theology, but I think that's why they would, if you put this to an early Christian thinker, they would just think it was a totally incoherent picture. They would also think it's not monotheistic, but I won't go into it.
Thank you for joining us today. If you would like to hear more from Ben, you can join us tonight. You'll be in conversation with Scott Stevens. We have a few seats left, so you better get online and RSVP. Expecting a full house, so we'll look forward to hearing from you again tonight.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Next month, you can look forward to Janice. Janice is going to share with us some of her thoughts around her developing research to do with theology and sport, and we'll reflect on the Olympics experience this year. So look out for a date, but it will be our next lunchbox seminar in September. Thank you.
Thanks.
I don't have to